Speaker.
Well done. Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the years following my time at university, I used to have what I guess would be called an anxiety dream, that I would dream that I hadn't studied for a really important exam that was about to take place. And I'd get very stressed about this, and I didn't know what the date was. And it'd be one of those dreams, I think others in the House may at times in their life have had similar kinds of anxiety dreams. And of course then I'd wake up, Mr. Speaker, and realise that in actual fact there was no exam for me to study for, and it was all unnecessary anxiety. And I have a feeling like that today as I stand in the House, as we debate the passing of a piece of legislation to ensure that New Zealand can ratify an agreement that doesn't actually look like it's going to happen, certainly not anytime soon. So it's, you know, I give a shout out today to all of those university students at this time of the year who are studying for their exams, which actually are going to happen, as opposed, I hope, to them studying for exams that aren't going to happen. Because if they were, they would be wasting their time, which is a little bit like what this House is doing today, Mr. Speaker, because everybody in, I would say, in fact, not only in New Zealand, but in most of the world, is currently focused on an event that will take place in the United States next Tuesday. It's a very important event. Both of the leading protagonists in it do not support the TPP in its current form. The TPP, Mr. Speaker, is going to be renegotiated. But on the National Party benches, the events in the United States, which most people would assume would be quite hard to ignore, are being completely ignored. They're ploughing on. We must pass the ratification legislation. We must be at the front of the queue. This is a continuation of the National Party's approach to trade that goes back many decades. In the 1990s, when the National Party was in charge of New Zealand's trade agenda, it was a little bit like playing the card game 500, and every time the National Party went to the negotiating table, they bid misere. They bid to lose the tricks. In fact, they actually went lay down misere. They put all the cards down on the table and invited other trading partners to play our cards for us. So that at the end of the 1990s, we basically had nothing left to do in terms of trade negotiations because we'd given away all the tariffs. We'd given away anything that we could actually usefully trade on in trade negotiations. And it was only with the election of the Helen Clark-led Labor government and with Phil Goff as Trade Minister that we were able to get back to creating good, high-quality bilateral trade agreements that delivered on access to markets for our exporters and indeed our service providers. And Mr. Speaker, that is what good quality trade agreements are about. Access to markets for our hard-working exporters, and as the years have gone on, many of those have been service providers. The problem with this agreement, Mr. Speaker, is it's not a trade agreement. That is the fundamental issue with this agreement. If it were only a trade agreement, like those ones that have been signed by the 5th Labor government, then this party would be supporting it. But the agreement that is ratified, or New Zealand's participation that is ratified in this agreement by this legislation, goes well beyond that trade agreement. It becomes what is called in the parlance a behind-the-border agreement. But, Mr. Speaker, what New Zealanders have been saying consistently over the last couple of years is that they are concerned about that kind of agreement, and I just disagree with members opposite when they challenge the notion of whether New Zealanders support the TPPA or not. Poll after poll has showed that New Zealanders have been concerned about it. And I was interested just recently as this week, or last week, the MYOB Small Business Survey, which the National Government's been very keen to promote for other reasons, actually said that only 39% of small businesses supported the TPPA. So 39%. So a sector that you would expect to be supporting the TPPA, less than half of them are. And that's because, Mr. Speaker, those small businesses know that while there may be some gains in market access, and there are some small gains in market access, and in dairy, as my colleague David Clark has said, the equivalent of the value of 3 farms, but some gains there and some gains in some other export industries. Those small businesses know that that pales in insignificance to what we are giving up as a country by signing up to an agreement that goes well beyond what most of us would regard as a trade agreement. And for the Labor Party, we have been clear that the litmus test of that for us has been the fact that this national government went into that agreement and failed to protect the rights of a future government to say that people who have no intention of living in New Zealand, have no right to live in New Zealand, could not be banned from buying existing residential property. Now, other countries went into that negotiation and said, we're going to protect the right to legislate to do that, because that's a sovereign right of this parliament. Because a future government might want to actually rebuild the dream of home ownership for New Zealanders. Lowest home ownership rates in 60 years in this country. So a future government might want to do that. The Labor government wants to do that. But the national government refused to protect the right of a future government to do that. Australia did, Vietnam did, not the National Party. And by doing that, what they showed, Mr. Speaker, was that this agreement goes beyond what is normal in a trade agreement. This agreement affects the sovereign right of this parliament in a way that would make many New Zealanders, and has made many New Zealanders, very, very uncomfortable indeed. And that's the issue here, Mr. Speaker. Because the people in New Zealand who have gone out on marches about the TPPA, who have written us letters, and not just the most vocal, but a range of people who are concerned about the TPP, feel that it is a symptom of a government and a society where the corporation is more important than the citizen. That somehow or other our rights as individual citizens are subjugated to the rights of corporations. Now, whether that's true or not, that is the impression that New Zealanders have gained, and the complete and utter failure of this government to actually go and talk to New Zealanders and listen to New Zealanders on the subject of trade has been one of the reasons why this agreement's been so unpopular. I actually will say Todd McClay's done a better job of that. Tim Grocer was so arrogant and so out of touch with the interests of New Zealanders that he put this agreement into a position where even those who might have had some sympathy with it were unable to support it. Mr. Speaker, Tim Grocer actually, when he briefed the Labor Party caucus, Labor Party caucus members when he came back from the negotiations, and he said at that briefing, everything I say here is, you can use as public. When he was asked and he was challenged about what was going to happen with Pharmac, was there a risk that New Zealanders would be paying more for their medicines? He said, well, no. And when we pushed him on it, he said, look, the text has got constructive ambiguity. That's what he said. The text has got constructive ambiguity. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we all know that the pharmaceutical industry will be pretty good at using that constructive ambiguity to make sure that New Zealanders pay more for their medicines. They hate the Pharmac model. And what they hate the most is the idea that the Pharmac model might see other countries pick up a similar model. They don't want that, and they will push hard to use that constructive ambiguity. So on this side of the House, we continue to have concerns about whether or not this agreement will lead to New Zealanders paying more for our medicines. Mr. Speaker, in Vietnam, the decision has been taken to delay ratification of the agreement while they watch what's going on. Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, has been saying there is a less than even chance of the TPP being passed any time soon. Japan has delayed its ratification process as well. All around the world, people are realising that there needs to be a renegotiation. And what the national government should be doing is standing up and saying, we got a rubbish deal on dairy in here. We got a rubbish deal on dairy in here. We didn't protect the right of this parliament to make laws about ensuring that we can manage who buys and sells houses inside New Zealand. We didn't do enough to ensure that the citizens of New Zealand's rights and the sovereign right of this parliament was respected. And we're going to go to that renegotiation table. And that, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what Tim Grocer told us he would do. If the deal on dairy wasn't good enough, he'd walk away. That's right. Mr. Fletcher Tabato's right. A gold standard agreement on dairy was the bottom line for Tim Grocer, and we got a rubbish agreement on dairy. Mr. Speaker, this is a weak agreement. It is not a trade agreement. It doesn't offer New Zealanders the kind of benefits from a trade agreement we would expect, and in turn, it pushes back on our sovereignty. This government needs to wake up. realise that the ground's shifted on the TPPA, get on the side of New Zealanders and get in there and start beginning a renegotiation process. On this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we support good quality trade agreements that will grow the economy for New Zealand, that will deliver good jobs. What we don't support are poor quality agreements that compromise our sovereignty, and we cannot support this legislation as a result.